Good morning, atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. We're a church founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics, and we invite anyone who's a member of the church to speak on any topic of their choice, as long as it's an atheist talk. So today we have a talk on, is obesity a disease?
Thanks, Ruth. Hi, I'm Jack, for those of you who don't know me. So while I was doing some reading in preparation for a talk on utilitarianism, I came across a great article on Less Wrong called Diseased Thinking, Dissolving Questions About Disease by Yvain. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing it and you're out there watching this Sunday. It touches on utilitarian ideas and a few great techniques for thinking that I've come across while reading Less Wrong over the years. So I decided to use it as the basis of today's talk. My talk is largely taken from Yvain's article with some minor edits to bring it more in line with my speaking style, as well as some elaborations on concepts which are explained in links from the article. I'll do a talk more specifically focused on utilitarianism at some point in the future. I know that's been requested. Okay, so let's get started. Sandy is a morbidly obese woman looking for advice. Her husband has no sympathy for her and tells her she obviously needs to stop eating like a pig and would it kill her to go to the gym once in a while. Her doctor tells her that obesity is primarily genetic and recommends the diet pill orlistat and a consultation with a surgeon about gastric bypass. Her sister tells her that obesity is a perfectly valid lifestyle choice and that fatism, equivalent to racism, is society's way of keeping her down. When she tells each of her friends about the opinions of the others, things really start to heat up. Her husband accuses her doctor and sister of absolving her of personal responsibility with feel-good platitudes that, in the end, will only prevent her from getting the willpower she needs to start a real diet. Her doctor accuses her husband of ignorance of the real causes of obesity and of the most effective treatments, and accuses her sister of legitimizing a dangerous health risk that could end with Sandy in the hospital or even dead. Her sister accuses her husband of being a jerk, and her doctor of trying to medicalize her behavior in order to turn it into a condition that will keep her on pills for the rest of her life and make lots of money for Big Pharma. Sandy's fictional, but similar conversations happen every day, not only about obesity, but about a host of other conditions that some consider character flaws, others diseases, and still others normal variation in the human condition. For example, attention deficit disorder, internet addiction, social anxiety disorder. As one skeptic said, didn't we used to call this shyness? Alcoholism, chronic fatigue, oppositional defiant disorder. Didn't we used to call this being a teenager? Compulsive gambling, homosexuality, Asperger's syndrome, antisocial personality, and even depression have all been placed in two or more of these categories by different people. Sandy's sister may have a point, but this talk will concentrate on the debate between her husband and her doctor, with the understanding that the same techniques will apply to evaluating her sister's opinion as well. The disagreement between Sandy's husband and doctor centers around the idea of disease. If obesity, depression, alcoholism, and the like are diseases, most people default to the doctor's point of view. If they're not diseases, people tend to agree with the husband. The debate over such conditions is in many ways a debate over whether or not they are real diseases. The usual surface-level arguments trotted out for or against classifying them as diseases are generally inconclusive. For this post, we'll apply several techniques discussed on Less Wrong to illuminate the issue. What is a disease anyway? There's another great article on Less Wrong called Disguised Queries by Eliza Yudkowsky, which is part of a sequence called A Human's Guide to Words. I'd highly recommend that sequence. In it, Yudkowsky demonstrates how a word refers to a cluster of objects related upon multiple axes. You may have heard me refer to the cluster cluster structure of thing space during discussions before. Okay, so consider a company where part of the production process is to sort objects. They need to be separate. They need to separate red, smooth, translucent cubes full of iron from blue, furry, opaque eggs full of copper. There are 5 axes here: shape, color, texture, opacity, and chemical composition. If you work in this company, you might invent the word rube to designate the red cubes, and perhaps bleg to designate the blue eggs. Both words are useful because they carve reality at the joints. That is to say, they refer to 2 separate classes of things, which it's useful for some practical reason to keep in separate categories. Calling something a bleg is a quick and easy way to describe not only its color and shape, but also its opacity, texture, and chemical composition. It may be that the odd bleg is purple rather than blue, but in general, characteristics of a bleg remain sufficiently correlated that bleg is a useful word. If they weren't correlated so closely, for example, if blue objects were equally likely to be iron-containing cubes as copper-containing eggs, then the word bleg wouldn't help you communicate with your coworkers. So you'd likely come up with something different. Disease, like bleg, suggests that certain characteristics often come together. A rough sketch of some of the characteristics we expect in a disease might include 1. Something caused by the sorts of things you study in biology. Proteins, bacteria, ions, viruses, genes, etc. 2. Something involuntary and completely immune to the operations of free will. 3. Something rare. Most people don't have it. 4. Something unpleasant. When you have it, you want to get rid of it. 5. Something discrete. A graph would show 2 widely separate populations, one with a disease and one without, and not a normal distribution. 6. Something commonly treated with sciencey interventions like chemicals and radiation. Cancer satisfies every one of these criteria, and so we have no qualms whatsoever about classifying it as a disease. It's a type specimen of diseases, like the sparrow is of birds, while the ostrich is not. The same is true of heart attack, the flu, diabetes, and many more. Some conditions satisfy a few of the criteria, but not others. Dwarfism, for example, seems to fail characteristic 5. Height is more like a normal distribution in the population and not 2 widely separate groups. It might get its status as a disease only after studies show that the supposed dwarf falls way out of normal human height variation. Despite the best efforts of transhumanists, it's hard to convince people that aging is a disease, partly because it fails characteristic 3. It's not rare. Calling homosexuality a disease is a poor choice for many reasons, but one of them is certainly characteristic 4. It's not necessarily unpleasant. The conditions mentioned above are also in this category. Obesity arguably sort of satisfies criteria 1, 4, and 6. It's caused by the things that you normally study in biology, it's unpleasant, and more or less commonly treated with sciencey sort of interventions. But it would be pretty hard to make the case for conditions 2, 3, and 5. It certainly appears to be the natural result of voluntary actions. It's not that rare, and weight in a population typically does follow a normal distribution. So is obesity really a disease? Well, what does it matter? Once we state that obesity satisfies some of the criteria but not others, it's meaningless to talk about the additional fact of whether it really deserves to be a disease or not. If it weren't for those pesky hidden inferences. A hidden inference is when one concept is so closely tied together in our minds that it's difficult to separate the two. Tied together with another. If you bring up the first one, the other jumps right along with it. You could also call this jumping to a conclusion, but it happens so fast you might not even notice it unless you're looking out for it specifically. So when a large yellow striped feline-shaped object leaps out of you from the shadows, you think, yikes, a tiger. Not, objects with the properties of largeness, yellowness, stripedness, and feline shape have previously often possessed the properties hungry and dangerous, and thus, although not logically necessary, it may be an empirically good guess that chomp. The human brain, for some odd reason, seems to have been adapted to make this inference quickly, automatically, and without keeping explicit track of its assumptions. In the case of obesity, while the question of whether or not it counts as a disease is pointless, after we've covered in detail which characteristics it meets and which ones it doesn't, we still make value decisions based on whether we call it a disease or not. If something is a real disease, the common thinking goes, the patient deserves our sympathy and support. For example, cancer sufferers are universally described as brave. If it's not a real disease, people are more likely to get our condemnation, like when Sandy's husband calls her a pig for her inability to control her eating habits. The difference between shyness and social anxiety disorder is that people with the first get called weird and perhaps told to man up, and people with the second get special privileges and the sympathy of those around them. Also importantly, if something is a real disease, it is socially acceptable to seek medical treatment for it. It may even be mandated. If it's not a disease, medical treatment gets derided as a quick fix or an abdication of personal responsibility. I, in this case Yvain, have talked to several doctors who are uncomfortable suggesting gastric bypass surgery, even in people for whom it's medically indicated, because they believe it's morally wrong to turn to medicine to solve what they see as a character issue. While a condition status as a real disease ought to be meaningless after the status of the other criteria have been determined, this status has acquired political and philosophical implications because of its role in determining whether patients receive sympathy or condemnation, and whether they're permitted to seek medical treatment. This, then, is the question in disguise. When we ask whether condition X is a real disease, the reason we want to know that is because we want to know, should we treat people who have condition X with sympathy, or should we treat them with condemnation? If we can determine whether a person should get sympathy or condemnation, and whether they should be allowed to seek medical treatment independently of the concept of disease, we will have successfully dispelled the disguise and cleared up the confusion. Our attitudes towards people with conditions mainly reflect a libertarian deontologist model of blame. Libertarian here, and in most philosophical discussions, refers to a position on free will, that our choices are free from the determination or constraints of human nature or biology, and free from any sort of predetermination as by God, and should not be confused with the political position of the same name. Deontology in ethics is roughly just a fancy word for rules-based. Think thou shalts and thou shalt nots. Under a libertarian deontologist system of ethics, people make decisions using their free will, a somewhat, for lack of a better word, spiritual entity, operating free from biology or circumstance. People who make good decisions are intrinsically good people, and they deserve good treatment. People who make bad decisions are intrinsically bad people and deserve bad treatment. But people who make bad decisions for reasons that are outside of their free will may not be intrinsically bad people, and may therefore be absolved from deserving bad treatment. For example, consider a normally peaceful person who has a brain tumor that affects areas involved in fear and aggression. One day, they go on a crazy killing spree as a result of this tumor. When sometime later, the tumor is discovered and they have it removed, and then they revert to becoming a peaceful person again, many people would be willing to accept that the killing spree does not reflect negatively on them, and that it doesn't open them up to deserving bad treatment, since it had biological and not spiritual causes. Under this model, deciding whether a condition is biological or spiritual becomes very important. The rationale for worrying about whether a condition is a real disease or not is plain to see. Without figuring out this extremely difficult question, we're at risk of either blaming people for things they don't deserve, or letting them off the hook when they ought to be punished. Both of these mistakes are terrible things to libertarian deontologists. But determining whether conditions like depression have a spiritual or biological cause is difficult, and no one really knows how to do it reliably. determinist consequentialists, in contrast, can do better. They believe it's biology all the way down. Separating spiritual from biological illnesses may well be impossible, but it's also unnecessary. Every condition, from brain tumors to poor taste in music, is biological, insofar as it's encoded in things like cells and proteins that follow laws based on their structure. But determinists don't just ignore the very important differences between brain tumors and poor taste in music. Some biological phenomena, like poor taste in music, are encoded in such a way that they are extremely vulnerable to what we call social influences: praise, condemnation, introspection, and the like. Other biological phenomena, like brain tumors, are completely immune to social influences. This allows us to develop a more useful model of blame. Because all actions are biologically determined, no actions are more or less blameworthy than others in any metaphysical sense. No action can mark someone with the metaphysical status of bad person, and thereby make them deserve bad treatment. Consequentialists don't want anyone to be treated badly. Full stop. Thus it is written, Saddam Hussein doesn't deserve so much as a stub toe. But while consequentialists don't believe in punishment for its own sake, they do believe in punishment for the sake of, well, consequences. Punishing bank robbers isn't good in and of itself, but it is good to the extent that it discourages banks from being robbed in the future. Although alcoholics may not deserve condemnation, societal condemnation of alcoholics makes alcoholism a less attractive option. So here, at last, is a rule for which diseases we offer sympathy and which we offer condemnation. If the consequences of condemnation are better than the consequences of sympathizing, then condemn. Otherwise, sympathize. This includes all of the consequences, both positive, like any decrease in the incidence of the disease, and negative, like the hurt feelings. And the actual magnitudes of these consequences in real life matter. Guesses and speculation will do in a pinch, but real rigorous data is required to really make the best decision. Though this rule is based on a philosophy that the majority of the human race would disavow, it leads to intuitively correct consequences. Yelling at a cancer patient, shouting, "How dare you allow yourselves to divide in an uncontrolled manner like this? Is that the way your mother raised you?" will probably make the patient feel pretty awful, and you look pretty ridiculous. But it's not going to cure the cancer. Telling a lazy person, "Get up and do some work, you lazy bum," might very well cure the laziness, at least in some cases. The cancer is a biological condition immune to social influences. The laziness is a biological condition susceptible to social influences. So we try to socially influence laziness and not the cancer. The question, do the obese deserve our sympathy or our condemnation, then, is asking whether condemnation is such a useful treatment for obesity that its positive utility outweighs the negative utility of hurting obese people's feelings. The real-life magnitudes of each of the consequences will vary depending on a bunch of factors, including the particular obese person involved, the particular person doing the condemning, the way in which they do the condemning, and the availability of other methods for treating the obesity that have other cost-benefit trade-offs, etc. The best action for any particular real-life case will differ in response to the different combinations of these factors. So, what are the consequences of fat shaming? Does it accomplish the goals that defenders of the practice say it does? That is, does it actually, in real life, motivate obese people to change their lifestyles and lose weight? Does it do so effectively enough to more than balance out the hurt feelings? Does it do so more effectively or with a better risk-reward trade-off than alternative treatments, like orlistat, gastric bypass, liposuction, or perhaps some truly friendly encouragement to exercise and positive reinforcement for achieving milestones? While I'm certainly not an expert in the complete medical literature here, I did come across a study that strongly suggests the answer is no. Researchers assessed, in this particular study, researchers assessed the body mass index, which is one way of measuring body fat based on height and weight, of over 6,000 people, all Americans ages 50 and older, in 2006, and again in 2010. They took these measurements. The people studied were a mix of sizes: normal weight, overweight, and obese. They found that the overweight people who reported experiencing weight discrimination were more than twice as likely to become obese by the next check-in in 2010. And the people who were already obese in 2006 were 3 times more likely to remain obese by 2010 if they experienced weight discrimination. Rebecca Poole is the Deputy Director of the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity at Yale University. She's been studying weight bias and discrimination for over 13 years. She said that stigma and discrimination are really stressors. And unfortunately for many people, they're chronic stressors. And we know that eating is a common reaction to stress and anxiety, that people often engage in more food consumption or more binge eating in response to stressors. So there's a logical connection here in terms of some of the maladaptive coping strategies to try to deal with the stress of being stigmatized. So let's talk for a moment about the ethics of treating conditions. If a condition is susceptible to social intervention, but an effective biological therapy for it also exists, is it okay for people to use the biological therapy instead of figuring out a social solution? My gut answer is, of course, as long as they weigh the costs and benefits appropriately. But lots of people find this controversial. In a libertarian deontological system, throwing biological solutions at spiritual problems might be disrespectful or perhaps dehumanizing. It may be a band-aid that doesn't address some deeper underlying issue. Others complain that the existence of an easy medical solution prevents people from learning personal responsibility. But here we see the status quo bias at work. The status quo bias is a preference for the current state of affairs, which may be inappropriate or irrational. A large body of evidence shows that status quo bias frequently affects human decision-making. We're more comfortable with what we know or with what's more familiar, so we often tend to stick with that even if there are much better options out there. To put it in the right perspective, we can apply what's called a preference reversal test. Preference reversal is a behavioral economics term that describes a situation in which preferences for different collections of goods change after the options are juxtaposed. When the options are considered separately, the preference for one option over another is sometimes different than when they're considered together, compared side by side. A preference reversal test is when we make up such a situation to find out whether our preferences really are what we think they are. So for example, if people really believe that learning personal responsibility is more important than, say, not being addicted to heroin, we might expect these people to support deliberately addicting people to heroin so they can develop personal responsibility by coming off of it. Anyone who disagrees with this somewhat shocking proposal must believe on some level that having people who are not addicted to heroin is more important than having people who develop whatever measure of personal responsibility comes from kicking the habit in the old-fashioned way. So then, perhaps a more medical treatment for heroin addiction isn't so objectionable as was imagined. But the most convincing explanation Yvain, have read for why so many people are opposed to medical solutions for social conditions is what's called, unless wrong, a signaling explanation. Katja Grace writes on her blog that the situation reminds me of a pattern in similar cases I've noticed before. It goes like this. Some people make personal sacrifices, supposedly towards solving problems that don't threaten them personally. They sort recycling, they buy free-range eggs, buy fair trade, they campaign for wealth redistribution, etc. Their actions are seen as virtuous. They see those who don't join them as uncaring or immoral. After some time, a more efficient solution to the problem is suggested, one that does not require personal sacrifice. People who have not previously sacrificed support it. Those who have previously sacrificed object on the grounds that it's an excuse for people to get out of making the sacrifice. At this point, the supposed instrumental action, as a visible sign of caring, has become virtuous in its own right. Solving the problem effectively without that visible sacrifice is seen as an attack on moral people. You can see this play out in the case of obesity. Some people voluntarily eat less enjoyable foods, and perhaps less food in general, and exercise hard to avoid becoming obese. Because of the personal sacrifice they've made, it's perhaps not surprising if they campaign against a pill that makes avoiding obesity easy. It's the same principles at work here. Of course, there are several very reasonable objections to treating any condition with drugs, whether it be a classical disease like cancer or a condition like obesity. The drugs can have side effects, which may be known or may be unknown, or may not present themselves for a long time. Drugs can be expensive. They can build dependence. They may later be found to be placebos, whose efficacy was overhyped by dishonest pharmaceutical advertising. They may raise ethical issues for children, the mentally incapacitated, and other people who can't decide for themselves whether or not to take them. These are all potential consequences that need to be taken into account and taken seriously. But these issues aren't different or more dangerous for conditions typically regarded as character flaws rather than diseases. The same good enough sort of solutions that work for cancer or heart disease might work for obesity or alcoholism. So in summary, people commonly debate whether social and mental conditions should count as real diseases. This masquerades as a medical question, but its implications are mainly social and ethical. We use the concept of disease to decide who gets sympathy, who gets blame, and who gets treatment. Instead of continuing the fruitless disease argument, we should address these questions directly. Taking a determinist, consequentialist position gives us the effective tools to do so. We should blame and stigmatize people for conditions where blame and stigma are the most useful methods for curing or preventing the condition. We should refrain from blame and stigma and allow patients to seek medical treatment whenever that is the most effective method. Thanks.